The dust tasted like grit and despair. Alara knelt in it, hands bound loosely at her wrists, the rope chafing less than the shame burning her skin. The sun beat down from a sky vast and indifferent, mirroring the emptiness inside her. Behind her stood Thomas, the man who had promised her a future, a man who now bartered for her like livestock. Before her sat a figure unlike any she had ever seen, a Comanche man. His face etched with lines that spoke of sun and silence, his eyes dark and unreadable. He had furs draped over his arm, goods Thomas deemed worthy of exchange for her. "She's plain, as you can see." Thomas's voice was tight with forced joviality, a sound that made Alara's stomach clench. "And sickly," keeps to herself. "Not worth much, truly. But she can sew a fair seam, and she's quiet." He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the Comanche, on the transaction. Alara focused on the ground, on a single, determined ant navigating a pebble. "Plain, sickly, not worth much." Thomas's words, delivered like a final judgment, were merely echoes of the cruel truths she had long suspected about herself, now laid bare for a stranger. He'd courted her family's small plot of land, not her. When the land deal soured, so did his pretense. Her perceived lack of beauty became his convenient excuse for dismissal, for this final, humiliating rejection. Too ugly, he had sneered days ago, the words a physical blow, before deciding she could at least be used for profit. The Comanche man remained silent. He looked at Alara then, his dark eyes resting on her face, her worn dress, the tremble in her hands. There was no judgment she could discern, only a deep, unsettling stillness. He grunted, a low sound, and gestured towards Thomas. A brief, tense negotiation followed, swift and sharp like a hawk's cry. Thomas visibly brightened. A transaction concluded. He untied Alara's hands with an almost rough efficiency. "Go on, then," he said, his voice devoid of any past affection, pushing her gently forward. "He will take care of you now, take care of you." The words felt like ash. She was property exchanged, a thing passed between men. She stumbled towards the silent figure, her legs shaky. He rose with a fluid grace that surprised her. He was tall, his presence commanding, yet his movements held a quiet strength. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak. He simply turned and began to walk, leading her away from the small cluster of white traders and into the vast, unfamiliar landscape. Alara followed, looking back only once at Thomas's retreating figure, a figure shrinking into the distance, taking with him her past, her hopes, her humiliation. The harsh sun beat down. The wind whipped her hair, carrying the scent of dry earth and something wild and unknown. Her fear was a living thing in her chest, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. She was alone, adrift in a world that held no familiarity, no safety, nothing but the silent man walking ahead and the crushing weight of her own perceived worthlessness. Every step away from her old life was a step into terrifying uncertainty, a journey into the heart of her own despair, guided only by the dark, silent shape of the man who now owned her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with her fear and his inscrutable purpose. Days bled into weeks. The initial terror began to dull, replaced by a gnawing anxiety and a desperate focus on survival. She learned the rhythm of the Comanche camp not through instruction, but through constant, watchful observation. They were a people of quiet strength, their lives dictated by the seasons, the hunt, the needs of the collective. Her new guardian, owner, master, she didn't know the word, didn't know his name initially. He was simply he who walks ahead in her mind, the silent man who had traded furs for her life. She observed him closely. His name, she eventually learned through snippets of conversation she couldn't understand, was Kale. Kale. He was a man of few words, even with his own people. His communication was in gestures, in the set of his jaw, the look in his dark eyes. Towards her, he was neutral, not unkind but distant. He provided her with a small hide dwelling, simple clothes warmer than her own, and a share of the food. He didn't force her to work beyond her capacity. He didn't demand anything of her. He simply existed, a quiet, powerful presence in her new, bewildering world. Her internal monologue was a constant companion, a conversation with the ghost of her past. See? Even here I am just here. Not wanted, just taken. The memory of Thomas's words, too ugly, haunted her nights, whispering doubts she'd carried since childhood. Her plainness had been a constant burden in a world that valued female beauty above all else. Thomas had merely confirmed her deepest fear, that she was fundamentally undesirable, unworthy of love or even basic respect. Yet, Cale didn't look at her with disdain. He didn't look at her much at all, or when he did, it was with that same unreadable stillness. But she noticed things. When the nights turned unexpectedly cold, he left an extra blanket near her dwelling. When a hunting trip yielded much, he ensured her portion was sufficient. He didn't speak of protection, but when others in the camp eyed her with curiosity or suspicion, his presence, his quiet authority, seemed to deflect it. He never raised his voice, never raised a hand. It was the small things that began to chip away at her fear, replacing it with a tentative curiosity. She watched him with the horses, his hands gentle despite their strength. She saw him share a rare smile with a child. She observed his patience teaching a young boy to track. These glimpses of his character contrasted so starkly with the callous cruelty of Thomas, with the superficiality of the world she had come from. In her old life, worth was measured in possessions, appearance, social standing. Here, survival and respect seemed earned through capability, quiet strength, and contribution. She had none of the former, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could learn the latter. She started trying to contribute, gathering firewood, scraping hides, simple tasks she could manage. She expected impatience, correction, perhaps anger if she failed. But Cale offered none of these. If she struggled, he would quietly demonstrate the correct way. His large hands patient, his expression neutral. He didn't praise, but he didn't criticize. He simply showed her. This lack of judgment was its own revelation. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being measured against an impossible standard and found wanting. She was simply a person, learning to exist in a new place. Her fear was slowly giving way to a cautious sense of safety, a feeling she hadn't realized she desperately craved. The vast, indifferent sky no longer felt so empty. It was simply the sky, under which she, Alara, was finding a way to simply be. Months turned into a full year. Alara's fear had long since receded, replaced by a quiet competence and a sense of belonging that still surprised her daily. She was no longer the trembling, heartbroken woman traded like chattel. The plains, once a symbol of her isolation, were now her home. She had learned the rhythm of the seasons, the language of the wind, the signs of the hunt. She could scrape hides until her hands ached, prepare food with practiced ease, even understand the nuances of the camp's interactions, though she still spoke little. Her plainness, the curse that had defined her in her old life, simply was here. It held no value, neither positive nor negative. She was judged by her actions, her willingness to contribute, her quiet strength in the face of hardship. And in Cale's eyes, when they did meet hers, there was no judgment, only acceptance. Their connection had deepened in ways she couldn't articulate. It wasn't built on shared histories or whispered secrets, but on shared silences, mutual reliance, and unspoken understanding. He continued to be her protector, a silent, unwavering presence. He ensured her safety, respected her space, and in 1,000 small ways, demonstrated a care that transcended the transactional nature of their beginning. He would leave a particularly fine piece of meat by her fire, mend a tear in her dwelling without a word, or simply sit near her in the evenings, his presence a comforting weight in the twilight. She, in turn, anticipated his needs, had water ready when he returned from a hunt, kept his dwelling tidy, offered him the best portion of the meal she prepared. It was a partnership built on observation, respect, and the quiet language of action. He had seen her at her lowest, most broken point, defined by another's cruelty, and had simply taken her in. He had not tried to change her, had not judged her, had merely given her the space and safety to rebuild herself. And in that space, she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. She saw herself through his probable eyes. Not ugly, but enduring, capable, simply. Alara. One harsh winter, food grew scarce. The hunt yielded little, and the camp faced starvation. Tensions rose. Whispers carried on the wind. Resentment towards outsiders, towards mouths that didn't pull their full weight. Though Alara contributed, she was still seen by some as different. One evening, a man known for his hard temper approached her. His words sharp, his eyes accusatory. He blamed her presence, perhaps all white people, for the hardship. Fear, an old, familiar visitor, pricked at her. But before she could shrink away, Cale was there. He didn't speak loudly, didn't resort to threats. He simply stood between them, his body a shield, his gaze meeting the other man's with a silent intensity that conveyed absolute finality. The man faltered, cursed, and retreated. Cale didn't turn to Alara, didn't acknowledge the moment with words. He just stood there for a beat longer, then quietly resumed his task. But in that moment, something profound shifted. He had claimed her not as property, but as his. He had defended her place, her right to be there. It was an act of quiet, fierce protection that resonated deeper than any declaration of love she had ever heard in her former life. She was no longer just surviving. She was protected. She was his, in a way that transcended ownership and spoke of belonging. The winter deepened, relentless and brutal. Food was scarce, the wind cut like a knife, and the threat of starvation was a constant shadow. Whispers of unrest grew louder, fueled by hunger and fear. The camp faced a critical shortage, and the hunters were returning with less each day. The man who had confronted Alara before, Red Crow, a large, embittered warrior, began to openly challenge Cale, implying his focus on the white woman had weakened his judgment, angered the spirits, brought ill fortune upon them. The tension was a palpable thing in the frozen air. One frigid morning, a small hunting party returned, grim-faced and empty-handed. Despair settled over the camp. Red Crow seized the moment. He stood before the elders, his voice harsh, demanding that the outsider be cast out, a sacrifice to appease the spirits, to lighten their burden. A few voices murmured agreement. Alara, understanding enough of the language to grasp the terrifying meaning, felt the old fear resurface, cold and paralyzing. She was back to being the unwanted, the burden, the ugly thing to be discarded. Cale stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke, the camp fell silent. His words were calm, measured, telling of his hunts, of his efforts, of the shared hardship. Then he turned to Alara, and for the first time he spoke directly to her in front of the others, using her name. He gestured towards her, then to the tasks she performed, preparing hides, tending fires, gathering roots when she could. He spoke of her quiet strength, her resilience, her willingness to face the hardship alongside them. He didn't claim she was essential, but he claimed she was part of them, not a burden. He finished by looking at Red Crow, his dark eyes holding a challenge that needed no translation. To cast her out would be to challenge Cale himself. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken history and raw emotion. Alara stood straighter, her own fear tempered by Cale's quiet defense. She was not ugly or worthless here. She was Alara, and Cale saw her and defended her. It was a moment of profound affirmation. The elders deliberated briefly, their gazes moving between Cale, Alara, and Red Crow. Finally, the lead elder spoke. Cale's words held weight. The white woman would stay. Red Crow's face twisted in anger, but he did not press the issue further. The immediate threat passed, leaving behind a sense of fragile victory and a deepened understanding between Alara and Cale. As the harsh winter finally yielded to the hesitant promise of spring, life in the camp began to recover. The plains turned green, the hunt became fruitful again. Alara walked beside Cale one evening, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He stopped and picked up a small, smooth stone, turning it over in his fingers. He held it out to her. It was a simple thing, but in his hand, offered without words, it felt like a gift of immense value. She took it, her fingers brushing his. He looked at her then, his gaze soft in the fading light, and for the first time, Alara saw a flicker of something akin to tenderness in his eyes. It was not the fleeting, superficial affection she had once craved, but something deeper, more profound, earned through shared hardship and silent understanding. Thomas had seen only ugliness and worthlessness in her. Cale had seen person. He had given her space to become herself again, not defined by rejection, but by resilience. He had loved her, not with pretty words or empty promises, but with quiet acceptance, unwavering protection, and the simple, profound act of seeing her value when she couldn't see it herself. She had come as a broken, discarded thing traded like property. She had found a home, a partner, and herself in the place she least expected. The journey had been one of fear and uncertainty, but it had led her here, standing tall and whole under the vast, open sky, no longer defined by the cruelty of her past, but by the quiet strength of her present, by the man who had seen beyond the surface and loved her like no man ever had.